Good evening to you all. Thank you for being here this evening. If you open your Bibles, please, to the book of Obadiah. We are in lesson 1 of our series on the minor prophets. We're taking them in chronological order. So we don't start with Hosea. We'll deal with Obadiah. And the reason for that, as we established in our lessons prior, in the introductory part of the lesson, you could pick various dates. But because we don't have Obadiah telling us exactly what date, you don't know exactly what king, because it had to deal with Edom, not king of Judah. So we have to kind of figure out where did the events of Obadiah, in which Edom looked at Jerusalem being sacked and ransacked and people plundering the city of Jerusalem, and when did that take place? Well, it could have taken place Nebuchadnezzar, in 586 BC, but the internal evidence points to maybe another time, in which we'll see in our lesson this evening as we'll take these questions that we have in lesson 1, and I think we'll see that it wasn't just one nation that came and plundered Jerusalem. It was a plurality of nations. If you turn your Bibles to 2 Chronicles, the 21st chapter, we'll notice 2 verses to help us establish the time for Obadiah. Jehovah stirred up against Jehoram, who was the king of Judah, the spirit of the Philistines, the Arabians, and they that are of Ethiopia, and the Ethiopians, and they came up against Judah, brake into it, carried away all the substance that was found in the king's house, and his sons also and his wives. So there was never a son left, save Jehoahaz, the youngest of his sons. And we'll see as he becomes a king. So this is an earlier date than the events that we'll be looking at with Jehoahaz and the prophets connected with him. And so it seems to fit the internal evidence very well. And therefore we're having an earlier date, probably 845 BC. That's the time frame that we want to be looking at. Now, as we look at our questions, remember this is written to Judah, but it's dealing with Edom, and yet it has a message for everybody at the end. So that's why I think it's there for us, because God even cares about the people of Edom, as we'll see with the book of Jonah as well. But our first question, is this message less authoritative if it is a vision instead of being the word of Jehovah, the message of Jehovah, that it's God gave you the words in which you're to say? Is it less authoritative from the standpoint of God if it's a vision? What would you say to that? No. And now the question is, why? They're from God. Hebrews, the first chapter, and verse 1, says, God having of old time, we're speaking about old time, 845 BC, spoken of the fathers and the prophets by divers portions and in divers manners. A little bit here that you need to know about this occasion, but in various ways, diverse manners. And so there would be visions, in a dream. And sometimes, as we see God speaking to Moses face to face, where he would speak to him face to face. And we notice this in Numbers, the 12th chapter, where God distinguishes between these different ways of communicating his word, but they're all authoritative from God, as a good example of Daniel has been. But in Numbers, the 12th chapter, of course, Aaron and Miriam are upset because Moses takes too much upon him, and of course God's going to take up for Moses. And he says in verse 6, hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, Jehovah, will make myself known unto him in what manner? So, talking about less authoritative? How can you get more authoritative? I will make myself known unto the prophet I'm choosing in a vision. What might be connected with that vision? I will speak with him in a what? In a dream. I think that's kind of where you might have your visions. And what is so interesting, most of the dreams, I don't have any dream from God, I'm saying that, but most dreams, you have people talking, don't you? At least that person that's carrying that knife to kill me is talking. I'm screaming. And all of those things that happen, that you could be speaking in a vision, but a vision is what you see. And a lot of times that would be in a dream. Can you imagine how vivid this vision was? What did we look at last week? We established from looking at the remains of Petra and remains of that area which was of ancient Edom, dwelling in the cliffs of the rock, how high those rocks were, and how impregnable we are. Nobody can come and destroy us. That's the pride of Edom. That's going to, partially what's going to bring them down. Can you imagine the vision that would be? I'm sure that'd be spectacular. And yet, there's another vision we're going to see next, where you've got a lot of locusts destroying a lot of countryside. What a vision that would be. And yet Joel says the word of Jehovah came to him. That'd have been a great vision. That'd have been a time to have a dream. Let's dream about the locusts instead of the high cliffs. So that doesn't make the point that when things were real vivid and something that you would think would be worthy of a dream, he'll speak to a dream in a dream. He dealt with the way he could, but there would be great visions, I think, for Obadiah in this event of Edom being struck down and taken all the way down to the ground when they thought they were so exalted high. And we saw that from Obadiah 1 and verse 3. Where you dwell in the cliffs and you mount up like an eagle nest and you get up as high as the skies, I will bring you down, said Jehovah. And God will. So we want to say that this is indeed an authoritative message. It is from God, even though he says the vision of Obadiah. Any questions or comments you might have? All right, question number 2. Why did the small nation of Edom feel so secure and prideful? Why do they feel so secure? Geographical location. Why do they feel so secure? Yeah, they sure did. And we notice that looking at that area of Petra now with they would have rooms and buildings in the rocks itself, but here you see the small openings and how high those rocks can be. Here's the idea of clefts where the high rocks would be. There would be the smallest one in this area is like 16 feet wide, and they were wider than that. But you could get that small a place going up 600 feet high with the rock, and it'd be very hard for an army to overcome you. They couldn't get in other than any other place. So these are some of the passageways that would be there for ancient Edom that were taking place. We saw some of the remains from the Nebaiotes, who indeed came later than Edom and pushed Edom, the Edomites that we're talking about, pushed them right on up into the southern part of Judah until they were finally eliminated in 100 AD. They ceased to exist as a people of Edom. John Hyrcanus circumcised all of them. They became proselyte Jews. And that's where Herod comes from. That's his background. But they at this time felt like they were invincible. A second thing, we'll see this come together in the text. Were they in a strategic place for commerce in that southern part of the Dead Sea? What's south of Judah, across the Nile? It's Egypt. You had the Philistines. You had people coming up that southern route and going through this area where there was indeed great trade. And when you have great trade, you have great wealth of the people. So they were wealthy. They felt like, even though they may be relatively small as far as number is concerned, they had the military and they had the topography working their way, and that they were invincible, and they had their pride in their wealth, and they had their pride in their location, and they also thought they were very smart. they were indeed wise men. And the wise men are telling them, don't worry about this, and this is what you ought to do. But that's the wisdom of men. But all of a sudden, when God has determined that he's going to bring the nation down, he doesn't consult with wise men. He's not impressed with your wealth. And there's not any topography that you can escape the hand of God. And he would bring them to an end, and he did. Of course, this is 845 BC, and it will eventually will take place in 100 BC. I'm sorry, I said 100 AD, but 100 BC with John Hyrcanus. So for 700 years, he allows them to go, and they will fight Israel, and they'll be defeated, and they'll revolt, and that sort of thing, as we saw earlier in 1 Chronicles, the 21st chapter, in Jehoram's reign. They revolted, and they went out, and God moved the spirit of these Philistines, that southern area, in order to come up and destroy Jerusalem on this particular occasion. So we see how they would build up in the hills of, in the mountains of the valley of Petra. And some of those are tombs, some of them are buildings here, and the idea of tombs in this particular area. And they just built them on the side of the cliff. The sandstone was good for that. And we saw pictures, so I'm not going to go there, but I wanted to show you where their pride came from. And do men and nations today pride themselves on their resources, on the vast army they may have? It's kind of hard up on the face of the earth to think that, well, our topography is really in our favor, since we have drones that can come over and get you anywhere you are. But at one time, they felt very secure. And the mountains provided them that type of the cover. Any thoughts along question number 2? All right, question number 3. How devastating will Edom's fall be? We hinted at this, and we saw a little bit of it by looking at other passages, but I want to make sure we have, I think, what is the thought here down, that what God is communicating to us. How devastating, there's the key, will their destruction be? Will Edom's destruction be? Let's just go through this. I think we can pick up. Remember location, wealth, and wisdom. And notice how he introduces it. Verse 5, if thieves came into thee, if robbers by night, and he said, how art thou cut off? That's just a parenthetical phrase. He said, if this would happen, but how devastating are you cut off? Now we get back to the story. Would they not steal only till they had enough? Rhetorical question, yeah, they would only steal till they had enough. That's the way it would usually work. We had enough. Times I've been broken into my house, they haven't taken everything. They took what they could carry off, but probably was easy. Some of it they thought was junk, didn't want that. But they got what they wanted, and they're out of there. They're gone. If the grape gatherers came to thee, would they not leave some gleaning grapes? Can you see why they inserted that in the text in your Bible, they steal only till they had enough? Because the context says in the next one, if the grape gatherers came to thee, would they not leave some gleaning grapes? Did they look under every leaf and get that grape? Or did they leave some behind? They would leave some behind. That's normally the way it would work. How are the things of Esau searched? Exclamation point. How are his hidden treasures sought out? How are you cut off? It's devastating what's going to happen to you. All the men of thy confederacy, and when you have a confederacy, what is that? All the men of your confederacy, who were those guys? Allies. Moab, Ammon. He doesn't mention them by name. But they were confederates with them in the sense of being their allies. They said, all the men of thy confederacy have brought thee on thy way, even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. And they that eat thy bread lay a snare under thee. There is no understanding in him. You thought they were your friends. You thought wrong. You thought wrong. Shall I not in that day, said Jehovah, destroy the wise men out of Edom, and understanding out of the mount of Esau? And thy mighty men, O Teman, that's in the southern part of Edom, ancient Edom, shall be dismayed to the end that everyone may be cut off from the mount of Esau by slaughter. So here are the things that they had in a war. They're allies. As long as you got money, you got allies. And there was the trade going between these nations and saying, oh, that's going to be, everything's going to be fine. And they deceived them. And their clefts of the rock, as we see in chapter 1 and verse 3, that's going to be taken out. It's going to be so devastating, there's not anything left of you. In 100 BC, that's just about it. They've left Edom. They've left Petra. They've left the places where they carved out their security. They're gone. And God will bring them down. And there again is showing the wisdom of man, how it rates with the wisdom of God. And all they need to do is be holy, be a holy people, but they weren't. And it was sad of what they were doing to their brother Israel, Judah, on this particular occasion. Any thoughts along that line, how devastating it was? It's so complete. He just has to break up the thought to tell you, oh, how shall you be cut off? And that's there because there's feeling there. How complete it's going to be. People wouldn't take all the grapes from a field. They'd leave some behind, not you. Oh, how your riches will be searched out. That's the point that he's making. Question number 4, as we go to verses 10 through 16. In verses 10 through 16, fill in their appropriate warning with the following warning phrases. He gives you 3 warning phrases. And the first one is, look not. Now, leading up to this, notice in verse 10, for the violence done to thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. It is devastating what's going to be happening to you. It's not only complete, but it's forever. And it will be in his time. In the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that strangers carried away his substance, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even thou wast as one of them. Now that leads up to these phrases. Now let's just talk about, that's what they did. And what occasion? We opened our study, chapter 21, 2 Chronicles 16, 17. We saw that's exactly what took place in that verse, those 2 verses. And notice that Edom is doing what? When the Ethiopians and when the Philistines and when the people from the south, Egypt and Ethiopia and so forth, when those people came through and they destroyed Jerusalem, as we're seeing in the days of Jehoram, what was Edom doing? What was Edom doing? Well, they were. He says don't do that, but I think they were. What were they doing, though, in this? It doesn't say anything about what we're about to say, or even that. But that's got to be there. But what were they doing? They were standing on the side, looking. They were looking. They didn't go in. They saw the enemies go in of Jerusalem, and that's their brother. Maybe it's Esau, Jacob problem, but they let them go. They stood on the other side and said not a word to defend them. They lifted up not a hand to defend them. You just let it happen. What does God say about such people? You're as one of them. Who's them? The Ethiopians, the Arabs, the Philistines. No, they went in and did that. You are like them because you did nothing You stood on the other side. Listen to it. Shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever in the day that thou stoodest on the other side. They're on the other side of their brother. They're with the enemy in that day that strangers carried away his substance, and foreigners entered into his gates and cast lots upon Jerusalem. Even thou wast as one of them. As one. It didn't say they were one. It's as one. Why were they as one? Because they didn't stand up and be counted on the side of God's people, Judah. Very instructive point. That when we stand on the side, and we don't take sides because we're going to be open-minded. And when the issue comes down to what needs to be stood for, and God's people are destroyed because no one's going to take the side of truth or what ought to be done, you're like the enemy. You're just like the enemy. They may be physically destroying the truth, but you don't say anything about it. You just keep quiet. And he said, you're as one of them. And that's how God looks at it. So now he says, as you look into this is what you did. As you look into their future, look not, because they're not annihilated yet. Their complete judgment hasn't come yet. But look not, as he says in verse 12, look not thou on the day of thy brother in the day of his disaster, and rejoice not over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, neither speak proudly in the day of distress. Jerusalem being distressed, well, that didn't happen to us. I guess Edom's better than Judah. We're not the target. We get along with everybody. And you're rejoicing that Jerusalem is being plundered. And so don't look upon the day of your brother's distress and rejoice about it. Paul tells us, 1 Corinthians 13, love does not rejoice with evil, but it rejoices with righteousness. That's what we rejoice in. What's right? What the righteousness, the character of people. Not to rejoice in your enemy. Even it might be a brother that you're having problems with, to rejoice in his calamity. Look not upon that day and rejoice in it with all of your pride. But that's what Edom was. Now, I think he's leading now. Here's what's going to be. This is what you were. You're just like the enemy. So now, don't act toward God's people as if they're enemy. Look not, and he says, enter not. This is not saying that they entered before, and now he said, don't do it. They just stood on the other side. But don't you enter in. If you've got that opportunity, don't you enter in the gate of thy people in the day of their calamity. Yea, look not thou on their affliction in the day of their calamity, neither lay ye hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. It's not saying that Edom went in there along with the Philistines and did the same thing. That's not what we see in Chronicles. But that's what they could do in the future. And they may want to. And they shouldn't enter into that unprotected place of Jerusalem and do what these people did. So enter not, and then don't stand at a certain place. Verse 14, stand thou not in the crossway to cut off those that escape, and deliver not up those of his that remain in the day of distress. What's he talking about there? Crossway, people escaping, delivering up those that remain in the day of distress. It's illegal today, but it wasn't then. Slave trade. That a lot of times that was indeed happening among people of Edom. Let Amos tell you that. Turn with me to Amos, another of the prophets that we'll be studying this series. But Amos 1 and verse 6, here's Gaza. Gaza is the southernmost city of the Philistine people, near Egypt. In fact, the Gaza Strip, 4 miles long, 4 miles wide, 31 miles long, and it connects Gaza with Egypt. And also notice how Gaza interacts, these Philistines interact with Edom. I will send a firewall on the wall of Gaza. I'll send a fire on the wall of Gaza, and it shall devour the palaces thereof. And I will cut off the inhabitants from Ashdod, and them that holdeth the scepter from Ashkelon. And I will turn my hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish, saith the Lord Jehovah. Verse 9, thus said Jehovah, for 3 transgressions of Tyre, yea 4, I will not turn away their punishment, because they delivered up the whole people to Edom, and remember not the brotherly covenant, probably between David and Hiram, how they were supposed to react. But they delivered up people to Edom. Verse 6, they carried away the captive of whole people to deliver them up to Edom. Edom would take people. I'm standing in the crossway. Deliver me people, and I'll sell them as slaves. Slave trade. And the people that were escaping the cities, they would have them, and they would use them for slaves and get their money. That's why they were rich. Money. You had the land. It was that we, and our wisdom. That's how we'll survive. So they had a lot of dealings with their Confederate people, with their allies. We had to put that in that terms. And so he says, look not. When your brother is going through a calamity and rejoicing with that, enter not. When they're defenseless, you don't do that, and you stand not, in order to profit from the other people's demise. And there's the warning that comes upon Edom. That was their nature. That was what they were doing, and they're not going to change. But God is bringing a judgment upon them. Any thoughts or comments upon that verse? All the points that are being brought there. What's the concept that he's setting forth for us to know? Remember, this is sent to Judah of what's going to happen to Edom, and especially realize that God's going to judge them of what they stood on the other side, when they were plundered by the Philistines and so forth. Any thoughts on that? Okay. Question number 5. What is the day? What is the day of Jehovah? This is we can take it broad, we can go small, or we can go small and go broad. Yeah, so you take it where you want to go. What is the day of Jehovah? How did you answer that? Yes, sir? Judgment. Can we put a one word with that? And this is found a lot of times in the Bible. Is it just a wrathful God that says, today I think I want to judge? Or is it always a righteous judgment? With God, it's always going to be righteous. But because of that, there's the positive side of it, always. There's the positive side of God's judgment, because who he's vindicating are comforted. 2 Thessalonians 1. You're being persecuted by this. Well, you rest at the day of Jehovah, the day of the Lord, when he's going to bring judgment upon those who know not God and obey not the gospel, and you're going to see his glory. It's a righteous judgment, Romans 2. And yet the disobedient are going to have the burden of their sin, the guilt, but those who are seeking for eternal life, that judgment's going to be a good day. It is a righteous judgment of God. And it is something that can be a joyous occasion for God's people and those who want to remain righteous. But it's a day of judgment upon nations. The broader speaking, it's going to be a day of judgment upon individuals. Look at Isaiah. Tell me the context. Isaiah, the 13th chapter, and verse. We won't read the whole chapter, but verse 9 and 10. What does it say? It says, "Behold, the day of the Lord," or the day of Jehovah, "cometh, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation, and to destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven, constellations thereof, shall not give their light. The sun shall not be darkened in its going forth, and the moon shall not cause its light to shine. We've looked at that phraseology. That's connected with the day of the Lord, therefore judgment. But judgment upon individuals in this chapter, Isaiah 13, or judgment upon nations. Chapter 13 and verse 1, the burden of Babylon. What is that? Individual, or is that a nation? It's a nation, yes. Isaiah the son of Amos did see. And your light is going to go out. And your nation is brought down. It's catastrophe for you, but it's vindication for God's people. And there's a positive side of that. That's why I say righteous judgment. Because there's a positive side of that if we remain righteous, what Paul tells us in Thessalonians chapter 5 is don't let that day come upon you as a surprise. The day of the Lord will come as a thief when you're not expecting it. That's a given. But it doesn't have to overtake you as a thief. Why? Because you're ready for it. You're living right. Every day you're living right. You can go any moment and you'll be right with God. And so his coming will be a vindication against evil. And he'll vindicate those who are his people. That's the day of Jehovah. And what Obadiah says, that day is coming. The day of Jehovah is near upon who? All the nations. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. You thought you got by with your cruelty? It'll be done to thee. Thy dealing shall return upon thine own head. See, it's always a righteous judgment. And when we term that's righteous. You got what you deserve. What you dealt out to others is back on you. I can't rejoice about it if you're going to hell and you're my enemy. It's sorrowful. But there's a sense of it'll return upon you. And he says, for as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain, and so shall all the nations drink continually. Yea, they shall drink and swallow down, and shall be as though they had not been. You've been drinking on my holy mountain, rejoicing in her demise. But on my holy mountain, you're going to be drinking all right. And it's the wrath of God. You'll drink it right on down. And it's coming upon all the nations. You'll swallow it down, and you shall be as though that had not been. He will utterly destroy the nation, especially in this context of those who would be fighting against his people on that occasion. Their future would be that. And it's going to come when his judgment comes upon them. But in Mount Zion, there shall be those that escape. All of a sudden now, we look at this day of judgment, and the nations are going to be drinking on the mountain of God, especially God's city, Jerusalem, getting all the wealth of that. They're going to drink his wrath, and till the point that they will be no more. So what happens next when we see that day of Jehovah? What mountain is being exalted when Edom's mountain, Mount Seir, is being destroyed? You got Esau's mountain, you got God's mountain. What's God's mountain here? Zion. Was there a literal Zion in Jerusalem? Yes, there was. But God used that to set forth his picture, especially in the New Testament, about Zion. Zion was always a place of refuge. And as God points toward the church, thank you. As God points toward the church, there's going to be that Zion refuge. And here he opens up the refuge for all the people, including Edom, including Ethiopia, including all those nations. But here, there's two things, and our time is short, but I want to get it. God's people will destroy Edom. And house of Esau, they said, they that of the south shall possess the mount of Esau, and they of the lowland, the Philistines. God's people will have their day when those nations are taken care of. But there's also the idea of a place of refuge for all the nations. The captives of the host of the children of Israel, they among the Canaanites, that possess Zarephath, and the captives of Jerusalem. And so the Savior shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be Jehovah's. There's a sense of God's kingdom as he's looking into the future. Mount Zion, you haven't come to Mount Sinai. You come to Zion, heavenly Jerusalem, a kingdom that shall not be destroyed and shall not be shaken. And God is looking at that in a positive way to end up that Mount Zion will be the one that's exalted. It will end time when God's people will be vindicated. Edom, Philistia, all these nations will be destroyed. And then, but kingdom will be Jehovah's. He'll have the kingdom. And that's that spiritual kingdom that's coming. Two questions. How has God fulfilled the twofold promise through Obadiah fulfilled? There's a sense of the physical sense. The destruction will come upon them. There's a spiritual sense that God's refuge, a place to escape, will be those escaping sin, will be there. Now, what we see, what godly wisdom is gained from the study of Obadiah? Number one, what was the basis of Edom's pride before their fall? I know pride comes before destruction. I'm not asking that. Proverbs 16:18 said that's wise to know. But what was the basis of Edom's pride? I've stressed it. What was it? True. But they put their in self, meaning my land, my wealth, and my wisdom. That's what gave them pride. And therefore, I pride myself. And they were indeed brought down. And this last question, rejoicing when your enemy falls, rejoicing when your enemy falls means you should do what? Proverbs 24:17-18. Well, don't do it. Don't do it. Why in Proverbs 24:17-18 should you not do it? Because God's wrath will be upon you and he will not destroy your enemy in that context. But if you're not to rejoice when your enemy falls, what can you rejoice in? In righteousness. He'll still be your enemy, but you rejoice in righteousness. Maybe the enemy repents. Like we'll see in Jonah. Did it make Jonah mad? You'll see how mad he got. We got to think like God and got to feel like God. And God is going to those who escape Edom, and they're going to be in that spiritual kingdom. It'll be a place of refuge, even though they were enemies of God's people and enemy of God. So it ends up with that positive frame. So if we're not to rejoice in our enemy in his calamity, I'm not going to rejoice in my enemy in his substance either. I'm going to rejoice in righteousness. That's the wisdom. And therefore, I don't have room to rejoice when my enemy falls. It makes me sad. I don't rejoice in his destruction. I don't rejoice when a gospel preacher preaches a number of years and then dies an atheist and proud of it. I don't rejoice in his demise. It's a sad thing. And that's the character of love. That's the character of what God's people ought to be. And I hope we end on that note. Any questions? I went pretty early, but we'll get into Joel next time, Lord willing. Okay, thank you.